Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever greeting is appropriate to people who are tuned into watching us now. Um, Thank you very much to Thoughtworks for hosting this little event. Thoughtworks, just to briefly explain who our hosts are, is a consultancy company that does strategy, design, and engineering. But probably if you know about us because we have an ethos of sharing our work in public. So you might be familiar with our colleague Martin Fowler, who has a very famous blog. You might know about the Tech Radar, where we share what we're looking at with new tech. You might know about books like Zhamak Dehani's Data Mesh book a few years ago, which made a big impact in the data space. So what we're doing today is we're introducing and discussing another really awesome book by a ThoughtWorks colleague. I'll introduce myself first before embarrassing Valentina with getting her to introduce myself. But my name's Chris Ford, and I've worked for ThoughtWorks for more than 13 years in various capacities. Right now, my focus is on retail and travel. But yeah, I've done many different things, and I'm interested in the full breadth of the stuff we do. Valentina, do you want to introduce yourself? And then we can get going with the content.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be very brief. My name is Valentina, and of course, I'm also working for Thoughtworks. I'm right now a lead software developer, and you might be able to tell from my accent that I'm Italian, but I'm based in the Spain office. I had also some short detours in Southeast Asia offices. So, yeah, been working for Thoughtworks for a while, and before that, I was in another consultancy in Italy, looking very much still at topics like agile, extreme programming. So yeah, I've had my fair share of experience with this.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll get into it in a moment. But yeah, agile and extreme programming, those kind of principles and ideas are very much infused in your book, Valentina, which I think will reward reading from people who are into those kind of topics.
Yeah.
But could I just start by asking you to say a bit more about your professional background? Like you're a consultant, right? What does that mean?
Right. So, as you said, I'm a consultant, and Thoughtworks is a consultancy. Before that, the company I used to work for was also a consultancy, which means I've been extremely lucky that I've been able to basically hop around from company to company without really having to do the whole changing jobs thing. So, this has kind of allowed me to see and compare different companies, and especially all the different practices for getting code from a developer's laptop to production. And of course, I've gotten to know many more through my colleagues. So yeah, that's also a reason why I wrote the book. Amongst all the companies that I've seen, basically I've managed to work with processes that were maybe faster than others, and continuous deployment happened to be my favorite one. Of course, that's why I wrote a book about it. So yeah, I thought that amongst all the companies I've seen, those that were practicing it were very, very fast in shipping updates, in debugging, in recovering from failures. And I thought that it was a topic that deserved a bit more attention and maybe a bit of a refresh in the literature,
Yeah.
since we all stopped maybe with continuous delivery, that I think was written about 10 years ago. And there are still some practices that need to be added on top of it, in my opinion, to perform continuous deployment, but I hadn't seen anybody talking about them. So I had to basically explain them maybe several times, changing from client to client, and so they all got condensed into this work.
So now you've written a book, and rather than having to explain yourself each time, you can
Exactly.
point
I
them to the
can
book.
just
Yeah.
point to the book and yeah, see, read what I wrote. But in reality, yeah, I expect I'll still have to explain myself many times. That's fair enough.
Well, I think you're right because I'm about to ask you to do it now for people who haven't read the book yet. Can
Of
you can
course.
you actually like let us know what does continuous deployment mean to you? And I guess what it means to you is now the official definition. Now that you've taken the time to write that book.
Yeah, that is, I guess, a privilege that comes with writing the book called Continuous Deployment. But in all seriousness, to me, continuous deployment is kind of an increment on top of, let's say, the traditional way of doing continuous delivery, where perhaps in continuous delivery, you deploy to production on demand and everything needs to be deployable, but it's not always deployed, right? There's often manual checks that need to happen, usually in some sort of staging environment, usually by some stakeholders that could be within or inside of the team. And there are perhaps scheduled deployments, perhaps on demand, but there is always some sort of manual interaction with the path to production that lets some hours, days, or sometimes even months of work accumulate before you're able to perform that final deployment to production. So continuous deployment kind of does away with that step, and it basically represents a continuous pipeline where if you commit a change to main or master, that change will be automatically verified and deployed to production. So there will not be a pause or a go to prod button. The pipeline will do the entire job of promoting that change. So the effect is that you commit, and whatever you commit will be in front of users and run by real users for however long your pipeline takes to run. It's usually perhaps 30 minutes, maybe 1 hour, but yeah, there is no manual interaction in the path to production. Yeah. So this means that basically your ratio of code commits to deployments to production is 1-to-1, and you have very little, if no, inventory stuck in the path to production, just waiting for a human being to manually click something. So I know maybe this wasn't a short definition, but yeah, in essence, that's what continuous deployment is full automation from commit to deployment to prod with no manual stakeholders in between.
It's interesting because I think like often we almost feel like letting commits rest or cool or settle before we deploy them somehow kind of helps or lowers risk. But I think you point out that that accumulated change that hasn't yet gone live actually makes it harder to know what's going on, because you mentioned a 1-to-1 ratio. That means that the mental model you have to have of your system is like, what is live? You don't have to think, okay, there's this staging, there's this other environment, and there's all this kind of complicated reasoning over time that you have to do. You've kind of presented quite a simple picture.
Yeah, in fact, not only I would say that letting commits settle doesn't lower risk, I think it actually increases it, right? Because I think it's only, let's say, a very human perception that letting a commit sit in staging for a week or two will make it safer once we go in production. I mean, sure, there will be manual testing, but in reality, what I think is happening sometimes is that we feel safe making the commit because we know it won't be deployed immediately, but we're actually just shifting the risk of that deployment to later, where it will be deployed
maybe a day
anyways.
that we're not at work. Maybe we're on sick leave on leave the day it actually goes live.
Yeah, and then it's going to production with many other perhaps unrelated commits, and when perhaps we've already moved on to a separate task and we have less context to figure out what's going on if the deployment goes wrong. So it's I think a very human thing to feel safer, but I think by deploying immediately, we actually take much more ownership of the fact that our code will go in production immediately, and that forces us to consider all of the quality gates, all of the impact on production metrics like performance, the impact on security. So yeah, it really, I think, empowers developers to make changes and really have production in their mind as a first-class citizen every single line of code they write, because they know that it's going.
So you say empowerment, but I guess also accountability. But there's no kind of like pretending, oh, okay, I didn't quite do this right. Someone else is going to look at it later.
Surely someone else will test it once it's in staging. It doesn't become my responsibility, but maybe we assume that some other stakeholders is surely going to call out if something doesn't work. In my experience, that doesn't really happen. But yeah, it's an assumption that is reasonable to make.
So we've got a couple of questions from folks watching. Thank you very much for people willing to do that, which I might ask. So one is by Giacomo that was asking, like, what kind of number of devs are we talking about in organizations where you've seen continuous deployment? Like, is it 3 people shop? Is it 300? Is it 3,000? What have you seen?
So I'm going to give the consultant answer. So it depends. I actually talk about this in the book. So usually I expect that a team that practices continuous deployment doesn't go over, let's say, the famous two pizza rule. So I wouldn't like to see a team of over 8, 10, maybe 12 people perform continuous deployment, just because at that point you have so many commits going in production that it's kind of easy to lose track of what's in the pipeline at any given time. So you need a reasonably sized team. Now, what do you do
Yeah.
if your company is really big? Well, that's why architectures like microservice architectures are really helpful, because then every unit of software is independently deployable and it can be overseen by one reasonably sized team. Uh, in fact, I wouldn't maybe recommend continuous deployment to, say, a startup that has a very, very big monolith that is just starting to break it into pieces, because then you have a team that is simultaneously big and a unit of software that is not independently deployable. You might have some issues there. But in companies that are already established, or perhaps very small companies with just one team that is really small, then that's usually a very fair scenario for continuous deployment.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about basically, scaling up one system and one team at a time. I must observe, though, more than 10 years ago, I think Facebook talked about how they want people on their first day to commit to production, and they famously have a very large monolith. I guess they're a bit of a special case, but yeah, certainly it seems more approachable to do it like you suggest, of two pizza team, understandable system, and though you can kind of continuously deploy there and take accountability for the effect you're having on that system that you own.
Yeah.
I have another question, actually. Thank you as well from other audience member for writing in. So Omer says, I think it's a clarifying question. So instead of review before deployment, so instead of the are you sure being on staging or whatever, you have review as part of the commit process. Is that right? That as you're actually writing the code, you would need to do that collaboration activity?
Yeah, exactly. And this is actually part of the benefits for me of doing continuous deployment, is this shifting left that is now a popular concept
Yeah.
of quality assurance practices, and code reviews being one of them. So we can't delay testing and manual reviews of the code until there's a staging environment with lots of new stuff in at that point that can get confused. We have to do it during the development process. Same thing for thinking about the performance impact of the changes and the security impact of the changes. We can't just wait until they are almost about to go to production. We have to do them earlier. For review in particular, I really
Yeah.
like to advocate for pair programming when doing continuous deployment. And some companies even mandate it, especially in regulated industries. You want at least 4 eyes on a certain change. So I think perhaps pair programming wasn't maybe that popular in the last 10 years, or in some companies more popular than others. But I would advocate that if you plan to adopt continuous deployment, it's a practice that perhaps you should reconsider if you hadn't considered it before, because it gives you that assurance that every change will be seen by at least a couple of people.
Interesting. And yeah, just for context, for people who haven't read the book yet, you have case studies from, online retailers for whom downtime is very expensive. You have a bank there, like the people who are adopting this practice are not non-serious companies. They're people who have a real mission and need things to work, and they found that they can do that with continuous deployment.
Yeah, exactly. I have about 7 case studies, and some of them also part of regulated industries. So it's definitely possible. And yes, it can comply with the auditing and all the regulations you can think of. So I think actually Dave Farley has a great blog post about this called Continuous Compliance, if you're interested in those specifically. And I really highly recommend it. It shows how your pipeline itself and your process itself, even though it's on the leaner side, can satisfy all of these regulatory requirements.
Yeah, I really like you brought up pair programming, actually, because I think one of the things that I quite enjoy about your book is that you're considering not just the code that flips bits into production, but you're thinking about what is necessary in a team to do this well. So I wonder if you could just explain, what kind of topics and sections does your book cover? Because I think there's bits in it that are maybe more broad than someone reading the title would realize.
Yeah, that's right. So It is, yes, a technical book, but I think it has a bit of something for non-technical roles as well, especially the first part. So in the first section of the book, I talk about the theory of continuous deployment. And that's not technical at all. It talks about the history of automation, how we got to this point, which is with a huge number of practices that were really instrumental in the industry, and about the benefits. So how does this impact for example, the 4 key metrics of you delivering software in your team, the prerequisites, so practices like pair programming, practicing good observability, alerting people, at the right time, at the right moment, avoiding noise. So and a myriad of others. So I would definitely recommend the theory part, and then I go into the practice, which is not just splitting your work into individual deployments, but also how do you want to structure your backlog to make the most of it?
Yeah,
Because
I really
obviously,
enjoyed that bit actually, because I
yeah,
felt like that was when I read it, I was like, okay, this totally slicing of scope into stories so we can play it in the right order, the right granularity. That's totally something that is a codependent practice on continuous deployment. But I think maybe in the literature on this, it hasn't been talked about as much.
yeah, exactly. And for example, it wouldn't make sense to do continuous deployment if then you don't leverage it, right? With it, you can push
Yeah.
the tiniest increment of code into production. So you should slice your stories accordingly. Perhaps put a feature flag so that you can see what your new feature looks like before you want to release it. Maybe release it in much smaller increments than you normally would. That allows you for a lot of granularity with user experimentation. That's something that you can think of when you're slicing your backlog, and you have to think about it differently than if you're, stopping every change. Then for the rest of the book, I obviously talk about the technical side. So you
Yeah.
get a new user story on your plate as a developer, and you have to start writing code, right? So every commit you do will become an independent deployment into production. How do you not break collaborating systems?
Yeah,
How
well,
do you
Ali,
make
actually,
sure?
sorry, so interrupt just to say, Ali at home is ahead of you because they asked the question of like, how do you resolve dependencies between components when you're doing this? Basically, how do you do? Sorry, you're about to tell us, but yeah, how do you make sure that if you're continuously deploying, you get all the pieces working well together?
Right. So that's perhaps maybe the core part of the book. As I was
Yeah.
explaining, is kind of in the middle. So besides encouraging you to read it, maybe a short summary is what I recommend when introducing new changes. You can always preserve backwards compatibility by using feature flags. That to me
Mhm.
is the core of releasing anything. But feature flags
Absolutely.
are not just a release tool, they're really also a development and a QA tool, because they allow you to hide any broken contract that you might have or any in progress change in production and still be able to test it in production while it's underway. So I definitely recommend those. And then there's a refactoring functionality that is already live. So that's where I borrowed a pattern that already existed, but I haven't seen it as really so popular. That has helped me a lot, which is the expand and contract pattern.
Yes.
So it's not something exclusive to continuous deployment, but it becomes mandatory. Let's say you're changing the contract between two services, say the type of a field. Now, you arrive at the situation where if, let's say, the field used to be a string and it's now a number, you have to deploy those two systems simultaneously, because if you deploy one first, then it won't be able to talk to the other one and vice versa. So before continuous deployment, of course, you could do a simultaneous deployment. Still, it wasn't the best because no deployment is truly simultaneous. You're still opening up maybe a few seconds of incompatibility, but it used to be harder to notice. Now, every commit goes to production in the order and with the timing that you wrote it and that you committed it. The pipelines take perhaps a different amount of time, so you must preserve backwards compatibility between systems all the time. um, this is where the expand and contract pattern comes to help, because it allows you to expand the interface of one system to support both types of calls. Then you can freely deploy the other. And finally, you can contract the interface to the contract that you wanted originally. And then I have a whole chapter about databases where I explain how this also works with data persistence, where you have to also make sure that historical data gets synchronized at the right moment during continuous deployments.
Yeah,
But
there's
yeah,
there are a lot of worked examples and very specific kind of nerdy detail that I think developers will enjoy covering. When you say that, it's quite personal actually, almost when you talked about those contract changes. Because I was just thinking back to 10 years ago, I was working with a travel agency, and we had this issue where everything worked perfectly on staging because we updated both the front end and the order management system to use a new contract, and so we were all high-fiving that we'd finished the feature. Then we put the front end live, and then everything broke. We're like, oh, we have to roll back. Oh my god, what's going on? And we're like, oh, okay, we haven't updated the order management system. Cool. So then we put the order management system live, and that also broke everything because we basically created this impossible timeline that we couldn't deploy to. And if only we'd had the wisdom that's in your book at the time, we could have maybe done something more incremental. But basically, we thought that we were just pushing the button and then going to the pub with a change, and then we discovered that we'd basically created a situation that was very difficult to get ourselves out of.
And the same happened to me actually, not on staging, but in local, where basically we had just switched to continuous deployment, and we had this refactoring to do again between backend and frontend. One of our developers made the two work perfectly, but we just realized we were pairing that there was absolutely no way we could commit and push either code base, because then one would inevitably go first. So again, going back to shifting left, this made us realize that with or without manual stop, there was no real order in which to deploy this change. We had to take a step back. We eventually had to rework the whole code base to introduce a step of backwards compatibility. So that really, really helped bring the problem to the forefront. So you could say that we didn't have to wait until it was all in staging and we tried to deploy. We realized it much earlier, which is yet another benefit of
a much less stressful time. So maybe actually it's a good segue to a question I wanted to ask, which is like, what does it look like when a team's practicing continuous deployment? Like, is everyone kind of like tense because they're like the slightest change will break everything? Or like what's the difference between a continuous deployment team and other kinds of team?
So that's a really good question. I would say that yes, there is tension maybe in the first week that you do it, and then deployments to production become so routine and you practice them so often that you basically don't really think about them so much anymore as this disruptive event that could affect all the users. Like you still have to pay attention to releases, but because everything you commit and push is either under a feature flag that is hidden, or it is as part of an expand and contract pattern, or anyway it is covered by a whole lot of automated tests, it becomes pretty straightforward to just deploy your code every day. And actually it's a very simple experience of your code base and production, because you know that they are always in line, they're always one-to-one. If your code works locally, it's gonna be in production minutes later, and you will have the proof that it will work in front of users as well. Like you remove quite a lot of stress from the deployment to production event.
I like the fact you say proof, because I always felt that kind of continuous deployment is almost like reality-driven development. Like you are just reducing that buffer between you and production and reality that'll tell you what's going on. And because of that, you would think, maybe some people would think that it would create a more tense environment, but in reality, it creates a less anxious environment because that uncertainty about and lack of traceability between actions and consequences is kind of wiped away.
Yeah, exactly. And if anything goes wrong, you really have the feedback minutes later. Same thing for if something goes right. For example, you do a performance optimization. There is almost no way to test those things outside of a production environment, sadly. I mean, even with the most sophisticated stress tests, load tests, you will never be able to replicate the exact load of production with the exact data of production. And you certainly don't want to move production data into pre-production environments most of the time.
Hope not,
so, also, another thing I want to add about development experience is that it becomes really, really straightforward to debug production issues, not only because they are most probably caused by the very few lines of difference that you've just deployed to production. So it's only one commit's worth of changes, basically. And that's very, very easy to trace what went wrong if something goes wrong. But also because if you're in an emergency situation, the lead time for your changes is incredibly short. So say one time we had a bug in production that we needed to debug, and we needed some extra logs in order to understand which path the code was taking in a particular situation. In half an hour, we just added some logs, and we found them in our production observability with users going through the path minutes later. I think that for me is the best example of how nice and straightforward the developer experience is with a practice like continuous deployment.
Right. So whenever whatever hits the fan, you kind of, everyone reverts to continuous deployment. Basically, you need to like make changes, see what's going on, and fix something. So ideally, you're in an environment where that's the way you work, and you have disciplines and safety nets every day, because otherwise you're moving to this new way of working only under times of great stress, which is probably not the best time to try out this new way of working.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you said it yourself. Often when there's a production emergency, you have like this two-track process. So if you're a company that doesn't do continuous deployment, you suddenly find yourself skipping all manual approvals just to debug what's going on. And that's a really stressful time for everyone. So it's not exactly the best moment to try a completely new way of working, especially if you don't have the tests to back it up, the observability to back it up. It's a bit
counterintuitive. Would you do continuous deployment with a team containing junior people then, or is it kind of a seniors only thing?
I absolutely would, and I have done continuous deployment with teams where maybe about half the team was junior. I think part of the practice is also building sturdy quality gates and sturdy team processes, where honestly, failure and making bad changes is expected. The purpose of the practice is not that only senior people who are always perfect are only allowed to make changes to the code base. The purpose to me is to build automation that is so efficient that it's incredibly easy to recover from failures. So a bad change could be caught by the static code analysis. It could be caught by unit tests, acceptance tests, end-to-end tests. Then if it makes it all the way to production, maybe it gets rolled back if you have a canary deployment system, or it is at least caught by the observability and sends an alarm really quickly, in which case then you can exercise again the very fast path to production to do a quick revert or a quick fix forward.
So a great place kind of to get started in your career and learn, and maybe have the freedom to make mistakes without horrible consequences.
Yeah, and not only because it's safe to fail, but also because you get to see what are the quality gates supposed to look like in a place where we can afford to deploy every commit to production without fear that we're deploying something bad that won't be caught. So it's a really good place to start for a junior person, because that to me is kind of the target state of any team that I work with, and you get to see it firsthand. Yeah.
Awesome. So I have a couple of questions that are maybe quite specific ones. Folks are wanting to know about how they should get started with it. So one question is from Dimitri, who asked about feature branches versus feature flags. Like they're saying, is feature flags the continuous delivery compatible one? So I guess he suspects what your answer might be.
Right. Yeah. So it might not surprise any of the viewers that I don't think feature branches are particularly compatible with continuous deployment, because it's just yet another place to accumulate commits and inventory. So even if your pipeline deploys automatically, the point of continuous deployment is to keep deployments really, really tiny. And if you have a huge feature branch, then we're going to expect to find a lot of code in there. The moment you merge it, that's going to be a huge change going through the pipeline and getting deployed all at once. So it kind of goes against the principle of de-risking deployments by keeping them small. And that's why I recommend using feature flags and small commits, where you can always test in production what your in-progress work looks like in a production environment.
Makes sense. I have a related question actually from Shakira, who says, okay, so that means if you've got a one-to-one between commit and deployment, does that mean you end up with a bunch of changes that relate to the same feature kind of spread out? Like, is that a problem? And like, how might you deal with that?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a feature of continuous deployment, maybe as much as a trunk-based development. If you're talking about like the Git
Yeah,
history, yeah, it can be interesting to figure out all the commits related to a specific feature, but how we solve it, to be honest, is just with tagging commits appropriately.
right.
So every commit will have a ticket number formatted in a certain way, and then we have, the Jira aggregator that shows us all the related commits. Of course, you have to be a bit diligent in doing that, but that's the same as being diligent in not putting unrelated stuff in a feature branch.
Makes
So
sense. I guess the feature flag kind of serves to unify them as well, right? Because anything the feature flag turns on is by definition that feature. And if you want to remove dead code after you've deprecated the feature flag, then kind of you've got traceability that isn't related to textual change. It's related to like the connections in the code.
yeah, exactly. So on the Git history side, you can use tagging and then you group them by their tag. But if you're looking at the code, of course, as you said, you have your feature flag. So if you've done a good job with it, it's at the outermost point where the execution branches of code diverge. So you
Yeah.
can pretty much be sure that anything under that if statement represented by the feature flag is probably related to the new feature. Of course, that is if you've applied it very diligently. Like there could be scenarios where you have the feature flag in several places, but that perhaps is an anti-pattern in and of itself.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think in the book you recommend like one point of control is the best way to do feature flags if you can. But yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So one final question, because we're just approaching time. If people have been motivated by reading your book or listening to you talk today, what would you recommend as the route to getting started with continuous deployment? How do you approach it?
Right. So let's say you're in a company where this is not really practiced. Actually, on chapter 3 of my book, where I explain like how to build up to it, I have a list of practices like observability, testing, all the different types of testing you should have put in place. Things like zero downtime deployments, what types of them there are, which one could be the best for you. I recommend going through that list and figuring out which practices are we applying today, and most importantly, what do the manual approvals that we have now before deployments are really catching? Like, are they
Right.
completely redundant and just a formality and everything gets caught by the automation anyway most of the time? Or is there actually some defects that we only see in demos, and why is that? So once you found that type of defect that gets caught, then think back of what kind of automation would you need to catch them earlier. So this way you can get to the point where approvals are just a formality. And when they are just a formality, that's when everybody will be glad that you've removed them.
Right. And if you never get there, well, you've just strengthened your tests and improved safety of your deployment process anyway.
Exactly.
So the effort
If
is
your
well worth it.
company never allows you to, then you've still made your pipeline so much better and automated a bunch of work that used to be manual anyway, and greatly improved the team's experience, the stakeholders' experience with your path to production, and most importantly, the user's experience, because they will be subjected to much fewer bugs. So yeah,
Cool.
definitely a worthwhile investment in the practices supporting it. And that's what I would recommend to start. Then once you've reached a point of maturity that you're really confident in, I think you just have to take the leap and try it out. You can always revert if it doesn't work and try again.
Makes sense. Very, very good advice on that point and everything else you've talked about today. So thank you very much, Valentina, both for writing the book so that everyone else can benefit from all the experience you've gathered in this, and also for coming on to this LinkedIn Live today to talk to everyone about it. I really do recommend the book. I think like it's a really good way of summing up a whole bunch of different modern agile practices. Like Valentina says, she talks about how to slice stories. She talks about all sorts of things with teams. So it's really a great way of getting a holistic view, I think, of a high performing software team today. So thanks everyone for watching as well. Please, yeah, check out the book if you get a chance, and have a great day, everyone. See you around. Goodbye.